You may remember the initials NARP, N-A-R-P, the National Association of Railroad Passengers, has been reimagined into Rail Passengers Association, which rolls off your tongue a little bit easier. Jim leads a professional staff in D.C. that works closely with congressional representatives and their staffs, regulators such as the FRA, the Surface Transportation Board, the Department of Transportation, to put the needs of passengers in front of decision makers who can do something about it. In 2016, the then Transportation Secretary Anthony Foxx appointed Jim to a two-year term on the National Advisory Committee on Travel and Tourism Infrastructure, and that was created by the 2015 Surface Transportation Bill. In May 2018, Secretary Elaine Chao reappointed him to a second term. Jim participates in the Federal Railroad Administration's Regional Plan Study Groups and is a voting member of the FRA's Rail Safety Advisory Committee, the RSAC Hazardous Materials Working Group, and the Passenger Rail Working Group. During Jim's tenure, Rail Passengers has fended off 6 separate house attacks on Amtrak, has taken a meaningful role in drafting the Senate 2015 Rail Authorization, which eventually became the FAST Act, led a grassroots effort in 2016 to repeal White House efforts to eliminate Amtrak's long-distance network tolling. More recently, Rail Passengers has built a Senate coalition of 94 senators supporting Amtrak and long-distance passenger rail, and has also successfully pressed passengers' rights to be on time in the federal courts, securing an important win last year when the Supreme Court declined to hear the freight railroad's appeal of Rail Passengers' 2018 victory in the D.C. Appeals Court. Jim came to the association after a 26-year career at Aviation Week and Space Technology, where he was executive editor. And Jim is also a search and rescue aviator, a Civil Air Patrol volunteer, and a former firefighter paramedic. So also in the back, you'll find some information about Rail Passengers Association. Please welcome Jim Mathews.
Okay, I am the last thing between you and lunch. That's a great place to be. It always is. Thanks for having me. I really enjoy this meeting. I told Peter this. I have meeting envy. Meetings that we put on. This is always a terrific meeting, always has a good group of folks. So I'm here to give you what a little cracked crystal ball we may have on what's happening in Congress here in the next few months. For the benefit of those of you, a lot of had to get up and go. I imagine they were asking Sandra about her presentation. I would be doing the same thing if I weren't here. But for those of you who need to get up and go, I'll summarize this in one sentence. Congress has 5 months from now to get its act together on passenger rail policy. And that's it. Because after that, we're into the election season, and reauthorization is likely to stall. And that is my bottom line. What can we do in the meantime? Well, we need to set the stage for the reauthorization. And the way we've been doing that is really almost for the last 2 years. We're talking about the value that trains deliver to the served community. And that has been a really important change in the conversation on Capitol Hill about trains. We've tried to shift the conversation away from this idea of subsidies and more towards what we all recognize and what we actually heard this morning in another context, that trains create value in the communities they serve. And this is true on the freight side as well as the passenger side. We've been doing studies really for the last 18 months or so, route by route, to demonstrate the value of routes to the communities served. You look at the Gulf Coast restoration right now, between the first part of that is between New Orleans and Mobile. Just that little segment will return $170 million a year to the economies of those 3 states for roughly $7 million in operating. This is an important benefit. So the conversation, and the reason why this is important as we approach the reauthorization, is to start to understand that if we're setting up a 5-year policy for rail in this country, we need to understand that what we're setting up here is a way to ensure that we as citizens can capture the return on equity for the federal dollars we have invested over the years in rail. And we're doing that. We're seeing that. You can see it everywhere in the country where we're starting to see that grow. Virginia just put down a marker for $3.7 billion to expand its already very, very important and beneficial service in the Commonwealth. That's just one example. There's all over the country we can point to those. This is the picture I like to show my congressmen and senators. The picture here with the blue dot is kind of the conventional narrative about passenger rail. Why do we care about all these other routes? We should just focus on the Northeast Corridor because the rest of this stuff doesn't really matter. But if you look at the map on the right here with the red dots, all we've done is we've looked at the number of riders per departure. So we've corrected for the fact that we have trains that aren't operating as frequently as we believe they should. When you start to look at that, you see a network that is well used. You see a network that's relied upon. You see people all over the country using that train when it's available. So when I look at that picture with the red dots, I see opportunity for growth and for advancing passenger rail in this country. So we are making the most aggressive, credible case for return on taxpayers' equity association. $180 million is the annual benefit of the Southwest Chief, for example, to Kansas and Colorado and New Mexico. Just those three states alone. We looked at Empire Builder, which serves 10 states, $327 million, the annual benefit of the Empire Builder to the 10 states served. We pay very roughly $57 million a year to have an Empire Builder. That's a pretty good return. So why are we talking about this, particularly if the reauthorization is likely to stall? Well, it's important to make sure that those talking points are captured. Because even if we're not going to get a reauthorization this year, what we are going to get is some kind of an appropriation. And we need to make sure that those thoughts are included as we talk about an appropriation. The other thing that's going to happen is there's going to be an infrastructure bill. We don't know whose bill it's going to be, and I'm going to talk about that in a little more detail here in a minute, but there will be an infrastructure bill, and these ideas that we're looking at a return on taxpayers' equity are going to be important to understanding why the infrastructure bill is a good investment for America. So, FAST Act. That's the Fixing America's Surface Transportation Act. That's a 5-year passenger rail authorization. It's the first time there's a rail title in the surface bill. So we've started calling it the passenger rail authorization. It is, in fact, a surface transportation bill. Now, if I'm a bad man, this is not going to pass this year. But we do need to make sure that whatever drafts are created in the House and the Senate, we include these ideas because they will form the basis for an eventual bill that will emerge. We've had a reauthorization blueprint circulating on Capitol Hill now for about a year. We will be briefing this during our on the Hill activities at the end of March and early April. I know I have some Rail Passengers members here in the room. Some of you will be joining us for that meeting. I would encourage all of you to come join us, where we will go and visit our congressmen and senators and share our reauthorization blueprint and why we think it's important. And we have tried to look at rail holistically. And we think it's important to enshrine the importance of national network in legislation. We think it's important to support short corridors. We think it's important to add service, add frequencies. But we also think that it's important to fix the host railroad operator relationship. We will acknowledge and have acknowledged, much to the chagrin of some of my members, that in a lot of cases, passengers are asking the freight railroads for their best quality of service for pennies. And that can't be sustained. We recognize that. One of the things that we pushed fairly hard for and what we're getting a lot of appeal on both sides, but particularly on the Senate side, we're pushing very hard for a shared use advisory committee. You know, there's this, we talk about the grand bargain has existed since Amtrak was created to relieve the freight railroads of that passenger responsibility and the liabilities with it. It's been decades. We need to revisit that because it's clear that there are obstacles to moving forward contained in sort of the birth story of passenger rail. And we need to fix them. We need to get away from make passenger rail go away so I can run my freight railroad. And we also need to get away from, well, let us ride for pennies on the dollar because we should. There has to be a new bargain. We support that, and we're trying to encourage our friends, particularly in the Senate, to support that as well and write something into the reauthorization, creating a forum with some real backing to help us negotiate a truce and help us come to a new bargain, because we happen to believe that a strong freight network is a bit as important as a strong passenger network. Rebuilding the fleet. This is incredibly important. When I testified before the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee in November, one of the things I shared with them was the fact that most folks who take Amtrak long-distance trains, anything more than maybe once or twice, they have a little survival kit that they bring with them. I do, and I shared it with them. I held it up for them to see. Shims, Velcro, duct tape, string. They're in a rolling museum, and that's got to stop. And Amtrak has asked for money to upgrade the fleet, and we think it's an important upgrade. And that's going to be part of our reauthorization proposal as well. And we think part of that has to involve domestic rail equipment manufacturing incentivization, very long term. But what we're really doing is I'm trying to import that idea from the aviation side where I came from. We need to make sure that we have an industrial base that is incentivized appropriately to build and maintain rolling stock and locomotives in this country. Because right now, there's just not enough juice to make that work. And we think that we need to make sure that we have an industrial base that can support passenger rail in this country. And we think that should be part of the reauthorization. So here's our funding levels. And this is kind of important. These numbers are pretty much in line with the gains that we've managed to secure over the past 3 years. And the reason we've been able to secure those gains is because we've been able to make a credible case in Congress that this is investment that produces a return, that this is not a subsidy in the sense of money goes in and nothing comes out. And we've seen steady increases along the lines of the increases we saw in the surface transportation bill. So this is just an extension of those amounts. This is pretty much the growth path that we've seen in the last 3 years. And if we were to get a 5-year authorization, we think this is the right set of numbers to make that work. And we think this is pretty much in line. However, we really can't just rely on the authorization process to make this happen, because as I'm about to show you, I don't think that we're going to get there this year. And in the meantime, as we have an appropriations conversation, we need to keep these numbers in mind. Amtrak is a piece of it. The CRISI program, the CRISI grants are very important. The State of Good Repair program, very important. The Restoration and Enhancement grant, very important. There's growth to be had, and there's investment that needs to be made, whether we get around to a 5-year authorization or not. So it's important to keep these numbers in mind, at least for the purposes of an appropriation, if not for a full 5-year authorization. So, as I said, the clock is ticking. The window for legislative action is very short. March 3rd is Super Tuesday. The party conventions this summer, July 13th, August 24th. All of this kind of takes place in this sort of compressed atmosphere of a presidential campaign. Looking at history, Congress is likely to kind of close the blinds and turn off the coffee pot somewhere around June. So that's why I said at the beginning, we've got 5 months if we're going to get any kind of movement on a 5-year authorization. That's a pretty short timeline. Now, in the meantime, there are 2 must-pass bills have to have them. We have to have a fiscal 21 budget or a continuing resolution. If we don't, we will have a government shutdown. That has to happen by October 1st. We need to replace the surface bill or get a short-term extension of the surface bill, because if we don't, on October 1st, we will lose the tax revenue for highways and transit. That'll be a pretty big crisis. So those are must-pass bills. So even if we don't get a full 5-year reauthorization, which I don't think we will, those elements must pass. And those are vehicles for us to carry these messages long-term about what we want to see in rail policy. My betting, June, short-term extensions. That's kind of where we see it coming down. But in the meantime, how many people here follow Infrastructure Week? How many people come along with that? Basically, see, it's always Infrastructure Week. Everywhere you go, everyone you talk to, all the congressional offices love it. And they should. The country is crumbling. We need to invest $4.6 trillion by 2025 just to get to an acceptable state of repair. That's not even about improving. That's about just getting us where we need to be. Everybody recognizes there is broad bipartisan agreement that an infrastructure plan is needed. You talk to Democrats, you'll get 3 or 4 different versions of an infrastructure plan. You talk to Republicans, you'll get 3 or 4 different versions of an infrastructure plan. Both President Trump and the Democrats have outlined infrastructure plans of something like $2 trillion. Now, the mechanism, how you get there, how you pay for it, this all varies wildly depending on who you're talking with and where they're coming from. But there is a consensus that we're going to see some kind of infrastructure plan emerge. All of the Democratic Party presidential candidates have proposed infrastructure plans. President Trump has proposed an infrastructure plan. The Speaker Pelosi has put down a marker about a large infrastructure plan. Somebody's going to do one. We just don't know who. And part of that conversation has got to include passenger rail and freight rail. I tried to keep it very short because I thought it would be over time, and funnily enough, we managed to stay on time. So I have now finished my presentation in time for you to do something else before lunch.